they thought it was real success that that they were managing to deport this mother and her children, with the fear of the fact that if they were deported back to Germany, would then be their one deported back to Turkey. We managed to win at that time because of the massive revulsion within Scotland about what we call the scar of Dungavel Detention Centre, and stop the detention of mothers and children as a direct result of that. But people are still being detained today. People are still being deported. And it's not very often that we can actually claim, victories against the Tory government in terms of the racist policies. And they are so far and few in between. But when those victories do happen, they have a massive impact, and they give massive confidence, to the movement. And it shows that actually we can win. People have often asked me over the years, well, why do you keep on going? Because there's so many instances where we feel that we have lost. You walk away from cases and you sort of think, well, what was the point? Years of campaigning, and then nothing changes, and people are pulverized, because that's exactly what's happened to them. Whether they be trying to escape on rubber dinghies and then get into this country and being told that they will face several years imprisonment, and anyone that wants to sort of help, somebody in a dinghy trying to help them onto the shore potentially could face, a jail sentence. So Kenmure Street is one of those standout alone moments of a victory, and I think it's important to start off with the day, how it began. It started around about 9 o'clock, where an immigration enforcement van on the day of Eid went into, without police protection or police assistance, went into Pollokshields, which is one of the most diverse areas of Scotland. Black, white, Asian, students, non-students, working, Muslim, Jewish community, Hindu community, Sikh community living in there. And it was on the day of Eid. So a large proportion of the community were actually off from work. And around about 9 o'clock, or just before 9 o'clock, immigration enforcement vans turned up with their usual marked vans, and went into this house, and decided to detain two individuals, two Indian men, two Sikh men, took them from their home. And very quickly the word spread, because their neighbors saw what was happening, and they rushed down the stairs to try and stop the immigration taking them away. One young man, who's known as the van man now, literally dived under the wheels of the van and refused to move. And it allowed him and others to contact their friends. There was people in various organizations. I mean, in that street, Kenmure Street, there are people who are student activists, people who are involved in organizations, people who are not involved in organizations, people who are involved in left-wing organizations, people who've been in many different organizations over the year. But the word spread extremely fast in terms of social media, and the text messages started to come out saying, everyone get down to Kenmure Street. Everyone get down to there is a deportation, attempted deportation taking place. And within the space of like about an hour, it went from 10 to 100. And within the space of a few hours, there was something like 1,000 people, surrounding the van that the immigration enforcement were unable to move. And it was around about sort of 10 o'clock, I started first getting the text messages, because that was the day I was supposed to be off. I was with the family and children, and started getting a text message of all people, Mohammed Asif, who I marched with something like 2001, I think it was, when he came to Glasgow in 2000 as an Afghan refugee, fleeing from the Taliban, a college director who'd left a college in Afghanistan, where his director had been had hung, quartered by the Taliban, because they taught men and women, and came to this country to seek safety, and has been at the forefront of the movement for refugee rights. And in 2001, I remember marching with him after Ferzat Dag, a refugee, was stabbed to death, a Kurdish asylum seeker. And when we marched with 1,000 asylum seekers from Sighthill and marched on Glasgow City Chambers demanding justice. So fast forwarding 20 years later, Asif is texting me saying, you need to come down. And then all of a sudden, more texts started coming down. There was various politicians, people there from right across, in terms of the SNP, from the Labour Party, trade unionist activists, who were putting stuff up on social media saying, everyone get down to Kenmure Street. So around about sort of 12 o'clock, started getting phone calls then, people saying, look, there are riot vans now arriving. And when I counted the riot vans, and I think it came up to around about public order vehicles, around about 40 of them, I knew that when the police send in 40 riot vans into a community, that is a community that's actually managed to hold together. There's been various flashpoints over the years, but the riot hasn't kicked off in Pollokshields, and the community has managed to stop these things happening, even when tensions have been high right across the country, even when there's been riots in Bradford and other places, and the police have been on sort of standby thinking something's going to kick off. So, of course, around about 12 o'clock, get a message saying that they're actually sending in ambulances to try and clear for the path, and people obviously who'd congregated, 1,000 people, were parting way, and then realized that this was a deliberate attempt to try and divide the demonstration. People were chanting, the chant was, these are our neighbors, let them go. Was the main chant. Refugees are welcome here. And just after I saw the pictures of the riot vans, I decided it was time to go down to Kenmure Street, because I knew that this wasn't going to end well. If there's 40 riot vans, and that means there's going to be at least 100 to 200 police officers, if not more, that would be present to basically take people into custody. The only option they would have was, because it was pretty clear from the pictures that people were not for moving, and that they would have to smash their way through. So around about that time, I went down with my 3 children, aged 13, 9 and 6, who were slightly bemused. As I think many people in Pollokshields were, because people were dressed up to their high nines for Eid, for family dinners and lunches and stuff, and had all come out. And when I got down there, you could hear the chants. But as I walked around the corner, I started to count the vans, started to see the police officers, so many police officers in reserve already waiting in public order gear, dressed up, ready to go through the crowd. And spotted the police officer, then decided to go straight to the crowd. And when I went along to the crowd, Mohammed Asif was there, and I saw on my left-hand side there was Rosa Saleh, who was one of the Glasgow girls, who was one of the original girls who, gone down in history as had fought the dawn raids that took place many years before within Glasgow, and was successful in stopping the dawn raids. And now is a Glasgow woman. And I spoke to the crowd, and I said, there's only there's one solution to what would happen today, and that is that these people must be released without condition. And that the Priti Patel's racist government will not win. Following that, I went into a police van and spoke to the area commander. And I said, look, you've got 2 options. He said, what's the options, Mr. Anwar? And the first option I said is release the men, release them without condition. It's not the case so that you'll be standing against the crowd or against the people in Scotland. I said, you have the First Minister, you have the Justice Minister also saying that these people should be released. And they said that wasn't a viable option, that they were in contact with the Home Office. They weren't able to get in touch with them. They weren't responding to calls. I knew from the Scottish Government that the Home Secretary wasn't responding to calls. And they asked what the second option was. The second option, I said, was you have 200 police officers, use your riot shields, use your batons, go into the crowd, smash it up, and you will be picking up the pieces for the next 20 years. I said, there is only one option. And after about an hour or so, I'm conscious of time is short. After about an hour or so, the police officer said, we'll come back to you. I went back to the crowd were chanting, saying, I said, there is no solution. There is only one solution. Everybody must unite, get the message out. By the time we reached to 5 o'clock, we knew people were finishing work. They will get down there. There was over 1,000 people by that point. And the police then came back to me and said, we've agreed. And I said, well, the agreement has to be that the men are released without condition, will not be arrested. They will be released into my custody and will be marched to the local mosque. That was agreed to, the police said. And of course, I cannot think of any other time that the atmosphere of that, in terms of the huge roar from the crowd, of thinking that at that point in time, we said we had beaten Priti Patel. We knew the implications of it. It was people power that beat them. People power in terms of 1,000 people saying, no matter what happened, we were not going to move. And it said, huge shockwaves, I think, through Priti Patel, through the policy in terms of what was conceivable and what was policy, and especially coming after lockdown. 1,000 people out on the streets together, black and white. And I remember going into that van and opening the door and speaking to the 2 men in Punjabi and saying, you've been released. Tears in their eyes, tears in my eyes, and turn around and saying, because of these people behind us, because of the people of Glasgow, that they united and they came out, thanked the crowd, and we marched. And it's actually, for the very first time, I think the police actually felt what it was like to be cordoned, because it was agreed that the police would form a cordon around me and the 2 men. We would march to the local madrasa around the corner. And at that point, the crowd just cordoned the police. So 1,000 people, marchers, cordoned the police. And it was a festival. It was a festival where people were united, people were happy, were singing, because it was a victory. And we marched around the corner, people were clapping and cheering. And the 2 men, when we walked up the hill to the madrasa, waved to the crowd and thanked them. And I think after that, I think the point of this was that we can win against a government like Priti Patel's. We've won before. We can win again. It takes numbers. It takes people power. It isn't going to take place by just simply writing letters or doing tweets. It's actually people coming back out onto the streets and remembering on each and every occasion when we have won by force of numbers and by uniting a community. That was a real lesson of what happened on that day of Eid on the 13th of May in terms of Kenmure Street. It's called the Battle of Kenmure Street. There was no battle because we had the forces of number and we won. And the police knew what was, they had no options but to release these two men who are still at liberty today. And
Aamer,
in fact, is that Priti Patel, finishing off now, but Priti Patel said her response was to turn around and call it was a mob. There was no mob there. That was a peaceful movement united by people with religion and without religion. And I think that's the example that we need to take forward in terms of how do we fight Priti Patel? How do we fight the policies of a racist Tory government? Thank you.
Great. And thank you very much, Aamer, for setting us up with this fantastic start to the meeting. It's so good to hear about our victories. It's so, so often they're swept aside. So that's a fantastic start to a meeting. And what I should have said is this meeting is being streamed on Facebook and on YouTube. So if people want to be involved, send in your comments, ask questions, you can join the Facebook chat and we will try to pick them up and monitor them. So please do get involved. This is about, not just hearing from a great panel of speakers, but an opportunity for us to think about what we can do locally in our areas and how we build this mass movement. So thanks a lot for everybody. Now I'd like to introduce our next speaker, really pleased to introduce her. It's Clare Moseley. She's a founder of Care4Calais, an organisation we as Stand Up to Racism have worked closely with over a number of years. So Clare, over to yourself.
Thank you. And thank you so much for organising this conference at such an important time. I think the government's intentions are now clear. The founding principle of the Nationality and Borders Bill, which I prefer to call the Anti-Refugee Bill, which is making its way through Parliament this week, is the removal of most of the rights for refugees who will come to the UK seeking safety. In fact, the bill could make it a criminal offence to enter the UK without an official permit. Judges will be able to sentence refugees who do so for up to 4 years. This is quite simply an attempt to deny the truth. Because those of us who work with refugees know that the vast majority have no choice but to travel illegally. Dictators don't issue visas. People lose passports in war and conflicts. Being forced to travel without permission is simply part of being a refugee. The government says that refugees should use resettlement schemes, which are pretty much the only legal route that exists. But less than 1% of refugees get chosen for them. So what is the other 99% meant to do? Just stay there and accept their fate? Or do all they can to help themselves and their families? What would you do? But in any case, the way that somebody travels is not how we decide who is and isn't a refugee. It's vital we remember this. According to the United Nations, a refugee is a person who has been forced to leave their country in order to escape war or persecution. Someone who, if they go home, could very well face death. These are the people we need to think about. When the government talks of illegal ways of travelling, they're just trying to distract us, to make us think it's okay not to help refugees. But that's a lie. For the last 5 years, I've worked with refugees. And it's only when you get to know them and you hear about the horrors they've suffered that you can fully understand why they're willing to take such terrible risks as crossing the channel in a small, flimsy boat. I've heard many stories of men and boys sold as slaves in Libya. Not just one or two, hundreds. It's common. They come from poorer nations and dictatorships, so there's nobody to protect them. In Libya, they're forced to work on farms and construction sites with little food and in shockingly unsanitary conditions. Many die there. Many others are killed trying to escape. Most of them are tortured, and they're made to phone their families while screaming in pain down the phone to beg them to pay a ransom. And as for the women, none make it across Libya without being raped, usually multiple times, and stories of pregnant women being raped are commonplace. I've also met a lot of people whose lives have been ravaged by war. Some of the very first people I met in Calais were refugees from the war in Syria, and they're still arriving today. They're lovely people, often gentle and generous, but the thing that stands out for me is how every single family in Syria has been hit. The war's killed so many people, every family's been affected. I'm continually talking to Syrian people who've lost a mother, a father, children, sisters and brothers, and the suffering just becomes impossible to take in. I can't imagine anything worse than losing a family member. Can you? In the last 2 years, I've started to meet people from Yemen, wonderful people. Many of these families have been decimated just like those in Syria. But in Yemen, it can be through famine as well as war. Can you even imagine watching a loved one starve to death? These days, I need to spend a lot of time finding mental health support for the traumatised individuals who've been through things like this. But I also have to counsel our volunteers because they speak to these people on a daily basis and they get traumatised themselves. I'm not telling you this to shock you or upset you. I'm trying to explain why it is absolutely clear to me that the people we work with every day are beyond doubt genuine refugees, that they fled their countries due to risk of death and have a very real need of international protection, even though they've travelled illegally. In summary, our government plans to viciously abuse highly vulnerable people who can't fight back. The Nationality and Borders Bill, or the Anti-Refugee Bill, is fundamentally morally wrong. It's based on untruths about refugees, but it's also based on the belief that most people want to turn their backs on people in trouble. And I know in my heart that's wrong. It's time for us to decide as a country who we are. Are we going to care for the most vulnerable and treat them fairly and with respect? Or are we going to create misleading new laws that criminalise those who turn to us for help? Thank you for organising this conference.
Thanks so much for that, Claire. And you're getting lots of applauses. And I just want to, before I introduce our next speaker, I just want to take an opportunity to read out some of the messages that we're receiving in the chat. Like I said, we are on Facebook, so if people want to be involved and send in messages, please do that. We are picking them up. So our first one is from Carol Price, who says, well done, everyone involved in incredible anti-racist unity. Well done, everyone involved, incredible anti-racist rally. We've also got one here from Grace Buckley saying, Priti Patel suggested we were letting rapists and murderers onto our streets without concern for their victims. Dara Michael Cavier, Priti Patel also suggested that asylum seekers be sent to Extension Island. How about sending the racists there? So yeah, lots of messages coming in. Please do keep sending them in and we'll try to read them out as we go through. I do want to introduce our next speaker. He is an ex-plenary camp refugee. It's Kenan. Kenan, can we pass over to you?
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, everybody. My name is Kenan. I am a Syrian refugee. I was an asylum seeker before, and I was in Penally training camp in West Wales. It was one of the accommodation I was in. The Home Office tended to move us from place to another. I was being in 5 different accommodation before finally being granted as a refugee. I came to this country seeking refugee, unfortunately in a legal way. It is the only way it's available. I didn't have the privilege to apply for visa. I didn't have the privilege to be one of the lucky refugees to be on this resettlement scheme. The resettlement scheme is something good. The government have to support it, but it is only serve 1% of the refugees around the world, or maybe less. To be in this scheme, similar to win a lottery. There is no chances, for me at least. So I came through different way, the only available way, seeking sanctuaries, and I have been granted refugee. The new government plan now, the new bill, will judge on the people based on the way they arrived. So some people who now are eligible to be refugees, they will not be able to be refugee in the future. Unfortunately, they will be called as illegal migrants. They will judge on their claim based on the way they arrived to this country, forgetting or ignoring that they had no choice. There is no alternative way. They don't have the privilege to apply for visa. Believe me, if they can do that, they will do that, definitely, for sure. But there is no other ways. The government thinks that after creating this new bills and creating this violence environments and welcoming environment for the refugees, they think that that will reduce the number of the refugees who will come for this country. I don't think that will deteriorating the refugees like me, for example, the asylum seekers who were fleeing torture in their home countries, and they have been escaped from the war zone and the conflicts, seeking sanctuary and just want to start their own life again. That some new bill here or changing the law there, they will determine them for coming to this country seeking asylum. It will only cause a problem to the government and to society to deal with the people who will have filled asylum claim because of the new law they are creating right now. It is creating more problem and add salt to open wound already, and it will create problems to the long term that will the society and the communities, the coming government will struggle to deal with. Additional to the issue that will create it to the asylum seekers and the refugees. Why the people will put themselves and their families in floated boat and risk their life to come to this country? Definitely they have some good reason. And definitely we can't mention all these reasons, but people who will risk their life putting themselves in the pot, try to come to this country for a claim for reason, definitely they have good reason to do that. And the current law now allowing them to seek asylum, the current law now allowing them to have the decisions, and if they get a negative decision, they are allowed to appeal on that decisions. And hopefully with some luck they will have their refugee status within times, even if it's now taking time, but at least the current law is supporting that, guaranteeing that. The new bill will not guarantee that. The new bill, they will say that no, you are an illegal migrant, we will send you to some reception center in Africa or in somewhere in this world, in third country, maybe a country you never hear about it, and we will keep you there for years and we will process your claim where you are there. And that definitely will be away from the any control you can imagine, away from the access, the reachable of the NGOs and the people who's willing to help. And that will, that means it's the government is sending these people to the death because they are taking their hope now. The most dangerous things now for these asylum seekers, when they are arriving to this country after being tortured in their home country, victim of torturing, victim of human trafficking, they have seen the horrible things till they arrived here. The only things was holding them together is the hope that once they will see if they will reach to that country, they will arrive to the country, they will seek asylum and they will be in sanctuary place, they will have status within times and they can rebuild their life. This is the hope that was holding them together till they arrived here now. If the government take that hope from them once they arrived, what's left for them? I think nothing except taking their lives, because it's not worth to live anymore. It's something I was thinking about it most of the times. If I was, for example, for some reason, I spent years on my journey, I spent 2 years almost on my journey. If I, for example, can a few months late, I will lose my right. It's something we have to think about. And I want you all to think about that. It's not about a new law or something else. It's about human rights now we are talking. Claiming asylum is one of our human rights. When I'm saying it's one of our, it's everybody. It's not only the asylum seekers and refugees. If you have to seek an asylum. And this is one of our human rights. When it's come to the human right, we should not compromise at all. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you so much for that, Kenan. Okay, so I'd like to introduce our next speaker. It's Francesca Humi. She's an advocacy and campaigns officer for Kanlungan, which is a Filipino migrant group, and also here on behalf of Status for All. So, Francesca.
Yes, hi, thank you very much for having me. My name is Francesca Humi. I'm the advocacy and campaigns officer at Kanlungan Filipino Consortium, which is also a signatory and a founding member of the Status Now for All network. We're actually here outside of number 10 Dowding Street at a solidarity rally that's being held to coincide with the amnesty or regularization debate that's happening in Westminster Hall right now, where MPs are debating a petition that reached over 100,000 signatures, basically calling on the government to regularize and grant status to all undocumented migrants immediately for 5 years, and then with a clear and safe pathway to citizenship. And this is something that Status Now, that the network and all of its member organizations have been campaigning for, because this, it was founded basically at the beginning of the pandemic in response to the disproportionate impact of COVID, of the pandemic on undocumented migrants. And I do apologize for the background noise. And we knew immediately when the pandemic started that undocumented migrants were going to be some of the worst hit populations, because as an already vulnerable population that has no recourse to public funds, limited access to support services, and a lot of social stigma, that they wouldn't be that they would be worst hit, and that also that they wouldn't be eligible to any of the furlough schemes that the government put in place, for example, that they wouldn't be eligible for sick pay, or even might not even feel comfortable asking for PPE in the workplace, because what we heard from migrants on the ground is that there's a sense that because of their immigration status in this country, they feel like they have very little negotiation power. So pre-pandemic, they felt they had very little negotiation power when it came to minimum wage, to time off, and to regular sick pay. So now, during a pandemic, especially for migrants whose living situation is tied to their job, like for example, if you're a live-in carer or a live-in domestic worker, then there's even less incentive to complain or to demand better protection in the workplace. And unfortunately, in our community, we know of multiple undocumented migrants who died of COVID because they did not, they were too scared of seeking medical help. So for example, I'll just quickly share the story of Elvis, who was an undocumented Filipino migrant. Elvis is a pseudonym. He'd been living and working in the UK for 10 years with his wife. And when he was working as a cleaner. And when he got COVID in April of 2020, he essentially stayed at home and did not seek medical help. He did not call 111. He wasn't registered with a GP, so he couldn't, ask a GP for help. And he also didn't go to the hospital when his condition became critical. So he died alone at home with his wife, who also had COVID. And unfortunately, this is a very similar story that we have been hearing over and over again amongst undocumented migrants. And more recently, it's been validated by the Bureau of Investigative Journalism's new report into how many GP surgeries across the country are limiting access to NHS services to undocumented migrants, even though undocumented migrants have a right to access NHS services, especially during a pandemic. It just seems like the humane decision. So this is why we're here in solidarity with undocumented migrants today at number 10, because we believe that regularizing all migrants now will save lives. It could have saved the lives of Elvis and of countless other undocumented migrants whose names and stories we don't know. And it could have protected people and kept them safe. So this is why we're here campaigning and demanding the regularization. Sorry, am I running out of time? Yeah, that's fine.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for that, and apologies. I'm sure you had lots more to say, and it was great to hear from you. But I do want to introduce our next speaker, who's also at the demonstration at Downing Street at the Status for All event. It's Shipa, who is a Zimbabwe refugee.
Hello, hi, I'm Chipo Parerenyatwa. I'm representing a Zimbabwe Human Rights Organization. We are here at the Downing Street at the moment, protesting against what is happening here. They are deporting the refugees, which is really a bad thing that we are condemning as human rights. Human rights people will not tolerate such a thing. Let me just give you a brief description of where I come from. I come from Zimbabwe, where we have leaders in Zimbabwe who have put themselves into power through dictatorship, through rigging elections. And those leaders who are in Zimbabwe are really abusing all the human rights. They have no respect for democracy at all. They are corrupt people. They are the people that are looting the Zimbabwean wealth, and people are not surviving from $1.25, and they are really suffering. There are no hospitals. They cannot get any treatment. Even they are not even paying the nurses and doctors. They are not paying the teachers the correct wages. This is the country that is going down the drain. And this is the country that they are chartering a plane to deport people to go to. And I feel like the agreement that they have done with the Zimbabwean government to deport people from here is like they want to kill everyone that is abroad, because whenever we are protesting in this country, they are looking at what we are doing, and they are really waiting for our arrival in Zimbabwe so that they can deal with us. So this is really a thing that I am condemning at all, that whatever that they are planning, they have to respect human rights here. We are all human beings in this country. We are against the deportation. We are saying they must treat us as human, despite your race, despite your color. And most of the refugees that are in this country are really working so hard. We are the ones who are doing all the dirty jobs. We work in hospital, we do everything. And at the end of the day, they want to deport us. And some of the people, some of the refugees that are in this country were born here. And their lives are here in UK. By taking them to another country that they have never known in their own life, it's like killing somebody, which I really think they have to sit down and think about it, especially deporting people during this pandemic period, where they really know that where they are going, they will not even get any treatment at all. They will just go and die. So I think we are saying to the government, no deportation. And if they are pushing us as refugees, we will try to push harder, because we will not go anywhere. Our lives are here. This is what I'm gonna say at the moment, really.
Thank you so much for that. And I think I speak on behalf of everyone here at Stand Up to Racism and those that are watching this meeting online. When I say we send our solidarity to you outside Downing Street and the work and the campaign that you're involved in, and keep up the struggle. Now I'd like to introduce our next speaker. I think really needs no introduction. She's a friend of Stand Up to Racism, an absolute furious campaigner in Parliament for anti-racism work. It's Belle Ribeiro Addy MP. Belle, over to yourself. Belle, you're on.
Thank you very much, and apologies, I had to just mute Preeti Patel. I'm due to speak in the debate that's ongoing at the moment today on this really disgraceful bill. And you know, time and time again, you know, the Tories want to paint themselves as being tough on immigration and talking about solving problems. There's just one thing that the Home Secretary said at the beginning that I actually agree with in terms of her speech, and that was that this particular immigration system, this immigration system is costly, and it doesn't work in any way, shape or form. But it's not costly and doesn't work because of the most vulnerable people that need to use it. It's the Tory government that's made it this way. It's the Tory government that has a chaotic Home Office that cannot process applications quickly and keep subverting human rights law. Is this Tory government that has outsourced the immigration detention estate and actually asylum generally to private companies who maltreat and detain, again, vulnerable people for profit and eventually end up releasing most of them. Now, this bill is completely horrendous, and it does nothing to end the hostile environment. That's one of the reasons why we're so firmly opposed to it. We need to look at what's happening right across the world, and actually where the UK has had a hand in some of it. We're living through a time of mass displacement, which is driven by war, poverty, and climate breakdown. And under the Refugee Convention, we actually have an obligation to all of those seeking safety. And we should be doing everything in our power to support those who are seeking safety, not criminalising them. But now is not the time for what the government are doing, which is actually dodging their moral and legal obligation to claim their fair share of refugees. But they've shown us time and time again that they don't care because it fits this narrative that they hope makes them win elections. All the government are doing now is actually rolling back on our international commitments and looking to expand that kind of barrack style accommodation we've seen in Napier and Penally. There's really, really horrible immigration detention centres not fit for purpose. Private companies, again, continue to run these, and just like the Americanization of our prison system, they are going to continue to profit. And this idea that we're spending too much, yes, absolutely, we're spending too much. But a lot of the money that we are spending is actually due to the Home Office, again, messing things up, giving all of their money to private companies to manage these systems, but also having to pay out when they've done things wrong. I cannot tell you the number of claims that have been made against the Home Office that have been successful, but not just that, how much more they would have had to pay if every single person stood up and made a claim against them, because they continuously flout people's human rights when they're making asylum claims. Now, the government attempting to attack so-called activist lawyers, this idea that they have to clamp down on our lawyers and their use of the law, it just points more to their authoritarian agenda. Yes, that many lawyers have been able to outsmart this Tory government and outsmart the Home Office because they've done some ridiculous things in terms of processing this application. But literally changing the judicial process just shows you the authoritarian kind of drive that we're on. And far from being swamped in this country by asylum seekers and refugees, we are actually amongst the lowest in Europe in terms of the amount of people that we actually finally accept. It's tiny compared to countries like Germany, France, Spain, and Greece. But this is part of the government's agenda overall, turning away the most vulnerable and not supporting them. They do that at home and abroad. And I always have to remind people of what the late, great Tony Benn said. So the way a government treats asylum seekers is very instructive because it shows you how they would treat the rest of us if they thought that they could get away with it. So we have to make sure that we don't let them get away with it. We have to continue to resist this onslaught of really anti-migrant legislation. It has been persistent for years now, and every single time we've jumped a hurdle, every single time we've made a gain, thinking of what happened in terms of the Windrush scandal, every single time another roadblock is put up in our way. We have been able to sustain some of the successes we've had in terms of people being allowed to stay in this country because people have always come out and fought for them, protested, raised the profile of different cases. And yes, it feels like they're doing this over and over again, but we have to keep on standing up for the rights of refugees. That is the only way that we will win. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Belle. And yeah, we'll let you get back to the other discussion taking place in Parliament. So just before I introduce our next speaker, I'd like to just read out a couple of more comments that we're getting coming through the chat. So we've got Jen R saying, so nice to see you outside the Houses of Parliament, Francesca. Brilliant work, right behind you in support of Filipinos. And then Maha goes on to say, refugees are welcome, legal or illegal. And a final message from Lizzie who says, the UK has so much to answer for across the world. We need to offer support to people who come to us for help. I know it's naive to say this, but it feels like the bare minimum we could do. So thanks everyone who's watching, whether you're on YouTube or whether you're on Facebook, please do keep sharing and sending in your comments and questions, and we'll read them out as we go through. So what I'd like to do now is introduce our next speaker. This is an MP who, really pleased to say, was out supporting the action that took place in Pollokshields when the Home Office tried to remove two of the neighbours there, and he was there on the streets in support of those two individuals. So it's Chris Stevens MP. Chris, over to yourself.
Well, thanks very much, and comrades and friends, I thank you for being here and showing your solidarity to the asylum seeker and refugee community. I want to firstly touch on some of the issues which my colleague Bell mentioned in her contribution, because the events of Pollokshields were, I think, a long time coming. Firstly, we had the situation where, as Bell's rightly said, outsourced companies are in charge of asylum accommodation. So you had multinational companies like Serco, who decided that they were going to lock change asylum seekers out of their accommodation without any reference to a court or a tribunal. And what we were astonished to find was that the court had ruled that because Serco is a private company, they do not need to comply with human rights legislation. So the outsourcing agenda around asylum contracts is such that these private companies do not need to adhere to basic human rights legislation. It really is, quite frankly, a scandalous and abhorrent situation that we found ourselves in. And we did, in Glasgow, commit through a number of organisations and politicians that if Serco did try to change the locks of asylum accommodation, that we would be there, outside there, exercising our right to freedom of peaceful assembly. And that's what happened in Pollokshields when the immigration van turned up to take two people away. The message was clear. These are our fellow Glaswegians. And it's worth noting the golden rule in how do you qualify to be a Glaswegian? You only need to have lived in Glasgow for 24 hours and you're a Glaswegian for the rest of your life. It's something that we are very proud of in Glasgow. And as Aamer outlined to you all earlier, that campaign was successful. And it's really quite instructive, actually, that the Home Office said at that time that the reason that the van was sent to pick up those two gentlemen was because they had fallen off the Home Office's radar. Not that they were criminals, not that they were terrorists, but because they just happened to fall off the radar. A completely disproportionate response, and they were met by the people of Glasgow, gave them a proportionate response to disproportionate behaviour. Now, we now have this bill being debated the next 2 days, and I plan to speak on this tomorrow. But isn't it just instructive of the government's priorities? As the COVID restrictions ease, we could have had a bill in front of us to repair the social security system. They could have allowed a 2-day debate on universal credit and the £20 uplift. They could have put down a bill, an unemployment bill, to address the issues of precarious work and to address the inequalities of the workplace, which COVID has exposed. But no, they grabbed the dog whistle. And that's exactly what this bill is about. It's clear dog whistle politics, pandering to the far right and all those misconceptions and utterly abhorrent behaviour. And what I find absolutely outrageous about this bill is it flies in the face of the Refugee Convention and places some of the most vulnerable people in the world at risk of poverty, exploitation and family separation. As the Refugee Council made clear, many asylum seekers have lived through some really traumatic and dreadful experiences. And I know that just from constituency casework from asylum seekers who come to visit me at my surgeries, that they have had experiences that I just couldn't contemplate. Many of us just couldn't contemplate in terms of if it happened to us. And these plans, with this abhorrent bill, you will find the Home Office will only add to that trauma. And asylum claims have fallen in the last year. But what I also find quite ludicrous about this bill is that they complain that asylum seekers are not coming over in safe legal routes. Well, the reason that asylum seekers are not coming over in safe legal routes is because the UK government have closed off a safe legal route to claim asylum here in the UK. And you will find in the next 2 days, Tory backbenchers talking about Marxist lawyers. You will find them talking about the courts overruling them. Well, try and get the law right then, and try and adhere to the law if you do that. But I think that what really concerns me as well is this is the whole barracks situation, but also that they want to follow the Australia model. And the Home Office Affairs Select Committee has heard some frightening evidence of what's been taking place in these camps that Australia have. For example, a quote here from the United Nations is really concerned about what the UK are putting forward, and that the Refugee Convention talks about not imposing penalties on account of their illegal entry or presence. It's quite an astonishing state of affairs that the government wants to get down this route. It's not in my name, and I don't believe it's in your name either. And I want to make it loud and clear that the people of Glasgow, if the Home Office try once again to try and take someone away in a van, or if they try and change locks and keep an asylum seeker out of accommodation, I'm very confident that the people of Glasgow will rise up again as they did earlier on this year in Pollokshields. Say it loud, say it clear, refugees are welcome here. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that, Chris. That was fantastic. And yeah, couldn't say it clearer. Refugees are allowed here. And I'm just going to read out a couple more messages that we've got in the chat that things are still coming through. So one message was from somebody, let me just see what it was. From Darren, who's saying, we've shut down Penally. I think that's great. And I think something we should celebrate. Another example of people power. And then we've got Dave says, a refugee crisis is a human crisis. The story is our story. We are all human, and together we can build a better world. We all have an important role in ensuring that refugees have the support they need. When we work together, we can help even more people feel safe from conflict, stay healthy, and forge ahead to a better, stronger future. So thank you so much for that, everybody. And yes, do please keep sending in those messages. So I'm going to introduce our next speaker, really pleased to introduce her, wonderful human rights activist, and was somebody who led on the ground during that fantastic demonstration in Pollokshields. So it's Pinar Aksu. Pinar, do you want to come in?
Yeah. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for inviting me over.
Pinar, can you just, I don't know whether it's just me, but do you want to speak a little louder or get closer to you?
Yeah, is that okay?
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah. Thank you so much for inviting me to speak today. I think it's one of those days that it's extremely important that we actually speak up and we do say what's been going on in terms of with the new anti-refugee bill. I think Aamer Anwar and Chris very eloquently explained the solidarity we had in Pollokshields. I mean, the whole situation has started, especially in Glasgow, since last year when people were not moved, they were actually evicted from their homes, from their accommodations into hotels across the city. And unfortunately, last year, we heard the news of Adnan, who passed away in one of the hotel accommodations last year in May. And this was followed by the Park Inn incident, which raised the profile, and it had a lot of international attention as well. And unfortunately, immediately, some of the news outlets had some headlines to say that it was a terrorist attack, and this just highlights the racist language we have in the media, the language that's used for people seeking asylum and refuge. And since last year, as Kenan had also mentioned as well, people are still placed in hotel accommodations, especially in Glasgow. There are still over 100 people who are in hotel accommodations across the city. Mears, who's the private housing subcontractor by the Home Office, they have indicated that people will be out by the end of July of this month. However, it's very uncertain if people would be placed back into normal accommodations across the city. It's very unfortunate when we talk about what people's experiences are and the way that the government currently treats people, especially as Aamer had also explained as well, when people experience dawn raid, when immigration officers comes to your house and takes you away from your house into a detention centre and potentially to be deported. And this is something that is not new to us, and that has been going on for so many years, which we have to continuously oppose, and to come out into the streets and to say that people do deserve to be in our cities, in our neighbourhoods, and this is not how we want to treat people. Unfortunately, I'm not sure if other people have seen as well. Today is also another sad day because one of the young asylum seekers also took their own life while waiting in the asylum system for many years. And in the same day, we have the Tory MPs who are sitting in their comfy seats in the Parliament, who are actually debating and trying to introduce more tougher laws with their new anti-refugee bill. And this new bill is against all sorts of human rights. It's against the international commitment, it's against international law, it's against the Refugee Convention. I mean, even the UNHCR highlighted and mentioned that what you are doing in there is a direct violation of people's human rights and is a direct violation to the commitment the UK has to welcoming people. And when we look at the numbers of people who are in the country, it's compared to other countries, it's extremely low. A lot of the people, when they seek asylum and refuge, they end up going to the neighboring countries such as Lebanon, Jordan, Turkey, and many other countries where they host thousands and millions of people. However, UK has, when you scale it and compare it, very small number of people who came to the country. And this was also seen that with the commitment of also welcoming children. And unfortunately, we are in a situation that even to welcome such a number of children seeking protection is also limited and cut by the current government we have. I think at times it feels quite depressing and unfortunately negative with the current government we have and with the climate and the bills that they are proposing. However, we do need to remember that we need to be in the streets. We need to be raising awareness about the stories and the journeys that people make to reach safety and sanctuary. And to remember that a lot of the people, they do come here is a direct result of the bombings created by the UK, US, and many other countries. And people, there's a famous poem and there's this famous saying as well, people do not pick to make the journey in the sea unless their land was safer. So I'd like to end by saying that the solidarity needs to be more than ever. We do need to organise within our communities, whether you're with Stand Up to Racism or any other anti-rape or welcoming organisations. We do need to be active in our cities. We do need to be active in our streets, and we do need to be active with our neighbours and communities to raise awareness and to say why people are seeking asylum and refuge and the rights that people have once they're in the country, such as the asylum support currently that people receive is only £37. And when people are in the asylum process, they do not have right to work. We need to raise awareness in these areas. And there is a really good campaign called Lift the Ban. And I would urge, if you're in a trade union or in an organisation, to please support the campaign to raise awareness about the difficulties that people face. Just to echo what Chris has also mentioned, we do say that refugees are welcome here. We do say that no one is illegal, and the fight and the solidarity continues. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for that, Pinar. That was absolutely fantastic. Yeah, absolutely. Repeat what you just said. Refugees are welcome and no one should be illegal. So our next actually isn't a speaker. We're actually going to play a video from someone who needs very little introduction. It's Diane Abba MP, who is the president of Stand Up to Racism, has spoken on, I think, almost every platform where we've had a national event, but unfortunately she isn't able to attend today. But we are going to play the video message that she's recorded for us.
I'm sorry that I can't be with you today, but it is so important to speak out against the new Nationality and Borders Bill. It's a reactionary law in search of a problem. This latest legislation from our Tory government tramples on British history of always being a country which accepts refugees. It also flies in the face of both the spirit and the letter of international law. This bill would criminalise some of the most vulnerable people on the planet. People who are so desperate, they're prepared to cross the open sea in dinghies. All of this is completely unnecessary and is the result of a frenzied government and the worst excesses of the tabloid press. Some ministers even admit it will not solve the issue of asylum seekers crossing the Channel. They just want to be seen to do something. And all of this is made worse by the reported plans of the government to have an asylum processing centre in Rwanda, in Africa. Until recently, most asylum seekers in this country came from Syria. More recently, the top countries that refugees came from are Iran, Iraq, Albania, Eritrea and Sudan. A glance at the atlas should tell ministers that the idea of Rwanda or any country to be an alternative for people seeking asylum here is completely inappropriate. Refugees are seeking safety, not trial by ordeal. Many of us, campaigners and MPs and people in the community, have long argued for the establishment of safe and legal routes for refugees from a number of crisis or war-torn areas. This would allow the smoothest access for people who are facing persecution and worse. But this government is doing the opposite, punishing asylum seekers and establishing an overseas processing centre to deny asylum seekers their rights. Further legislation is planned that will also attempt to make the government less accountable to the courts. It seems clear that at least part of the motivation for this is to stop refugees using some of the excellent refugee lawyers out there. Inevitably, for such a terrible policy, the policy is based on a falsehood. Government ministers are trying to claim we are being swamped by the numbers of people crossing the Channel. But the numbers of people crossing the Channel are tiny in comparison to overall migration. The Refugee Council estimates that 9,000 people who would be able to make a successful asylum claim may be denied if the government proposals are adopted. This is a relatively small number. Currently, 5.6 million people from the European Union are entitled to seek settled status in this country, although, of course, they face the usual thoughtlessness and incompetence from the Home Office. In addition, the government has said it will grant leave to remain to holders of British national overseas passports from Hong Kong. This is a good thing, and it means that potentially hundreds and thousands of extra people will come to this country. The numbers of people crossing the Channel in dinghies is minuscule by comparison. The refugees are not a threat, they are just a convenient scapegoat. The government's plans are addressing a non-existent problem. It's part of its reactionary authoritarian social policy which panders to right-wing media. We must oppose the government's plans firmly and resolutely. They must not win.
Okay, I think we can all say thank you very much. I'm sure Dan will get the message that says thank you to her for sending that video recording in. So just before I go to our next speaker, I am going to just read out some more messages we've got from the chat on Facebook. So Sally says, Mears are making millions out of the misery of refugees, and people may or may not know Mears is a company that looks after the accommodation in some cases for refugees. And Darren says, good people need to rise up and say enough is enough. We are the real power, not the politicians. People power must and will prevail. And yes, wide words, especially when you think about what happened in Pollokshields. And Grace goes on to say, I have families with no duvets, mold in their property, no smoke alarms, one set of cutlery, broken beds, 4 chairs for a family of 8. So that gives you an idea of just how badly people seeking asylum are being treated in Britain today. If you're not in a detention centre, you're fortunate to be out of a detention centre, it doesn't mean your lives are any easier. So thank you very much for everyone sending in their comments. Please do continue sharing your comments and obviously sharing the link to this meeting as well. I'm going to introduce our next speaker, who's Mark Serwotka. He's a PCS General Secretary. Mark, over to yourself.
Well, thanks very much, Nahalia, and good evening to everyone. Can I first of all bring fraternal greetings from my trade union, PCS. PCS organises people working in the civil service, including people in the Home Office. And I have no hesitation in saying that my heart jumped with joy when I saw the scenes in Glasgow where the Home Office deportation was stopped. And it's been inspiring tonight to hear from what I think has been the most amazing set of speakers. And I want to congratulate Stand Up to Racism, because I think this meeting deserves to be seen and listened to on a massive wide-scale basis, because people have to hear the arguments being put across tonight by those who've been on the receiving end, those people who've come to this country, who've been in detention, who are fighting injustice. Their voice needs to be heard, because we have to make sure that this debate is not about what happens in Parliament, where the Tories with an 80-seat majority will probably pass the legislation. It has to be about how we win hearts and minds to take the action required to overturn the law if it becomes law, and to protect people in the meantime. So well done to everyone for what I think has been an amazing meeting. There's three things briefly I wanted to talk about. I think one is just two elements of exactly how inhumane this legislation is. Secondly, how people have pointed out, and I want to add a couple of facts myself, to the fact that this is not a problem at all in real terms. The numbers are tiny, and it is all about politics at its worst. And thirdly, what I hope we can all do about it. But first of all, let's just think of two aspects of the bill that we've heard of it tonight. If this bill becomes law, asylum seekers deemed to have arrived illegally, and that's the words in the bill, will not have the same entitlements as existing asylum seekers, even if their claims then become successful. They could be removed at any time, even if they are successful in winning asylum. And as Diane said, the Refugee Council have already estimated that 9,000 people currently accepted under the existing rules would be rejected if this becomes law because of the means in which they come to this country. Now, basic humanity should tell any of us, it doesn't matter by what means you come to this country. What matters is your case and basic human dignity that says, however you came here, if you need to be in this country, we should welcome people with open arms, and not just welcome them and put them in detention camps with unsatisfactory amounts of money to survive on, but welcome them into our society where people are probably desperate to make a contribution to a country that at the end of the day is built on immigration over many, many centuries. The second thing I think to say is that the bill also would allow for people to be removed while their case is being assessed or their appeal is being heard, potentially opening the door to offshoring processing to other countries. Now, we've heard some of the speculation where those other countries are. Let's call this out for what it is. This is inhumane. This is based on the model that we see in Australia, where people are kept marooned on an island, where people hopefully will forget that anyone's there. It has no place in a so-called democratic country that we could even think of doing that to people while their claims are being heard. And thirdly, this bill would allow for something called boat pushbacks, which means it would become lawful to intercept boats on their way to this country and escort them back in to other countries' waters. Now, the UNHCR says that that is, quote, simply illegal. I mean, let's get real about this. We are talking about intercepting people coming in dinghies or other vehicles and then escorting them back out of British waters. Again, it is inhumane and people will suffer as a result. The second point to make is the numbers, because the Tories are going to make out that this bill is about criminal gangs smuggling people in a country that cannot afford to have people coming in by massive loads, that we're going to be swamped. The reality is last year there was a 24% reduction in asylum applications in Britain. Last year, where the tabloids told us there were record amounts of people coming in dinghy crossings across the Channel, the total amount of that record amount represented just 10% of asylum applications in Britain in 2002. It is a tiny amount in a country of our size that could easily accommodate these people coming. And in fact, Britain is currently 17th out of 28 European Union countries in terms of taking asylum applications per capita of the population. So we are not top, we are 17 out of 28. And then let us look at the effect that we've heard about tonight, some brilliant speeches that we've heard tonight. But 1,146 people have died trying to cross seas to get into Europe between January and June. 1,146 people, individuals, men, women, children, with backstories, many of which will be absolutely catastrophic, yet they are dying in our seas because we are having a politics based on putting up shutters and telling people they are not welcome. We should welcome people with open arms. And as we've heard from the demonstration tonight, on Wednesday, 150 people will be deported to Zimbabwe, a country with the most appalling human rights records, where who knows what is going to happen to people who may well have been opponents of the Zimbabwean regime, who will be sent back to Zimbabwe by our government. Now, this should make us angry, this should make us furious, and this should make us determined to do something to overturn these injustices. But the question is, how are we going to do it? I give full sort of solidarity to all parliamentarians we've heard from tonight, who I think will make brilliant speeches in Parliament, but the chances are the Tories with an 80-seat majority will get this bill through Parliament. So what do we have to do? Well, we have to do everything we can, all means possible, in order to ensure that A, we campaign against this bill, but B, we campaign against it being implemented, and in so doing, also campaign to improve the rights of those people who have already come to this country. And that means, in my view, the following. It means doing everything we can legally to challenge whatever we can around individual cases, around collectively. We've got many organizations, trade unions, people have got money. We need to put as much legal pressure as we can to win as many cases as we can against the government. Secondly, we have to win hearts and minds. We, like myself, people in trade unions, have millions of members. We know that many of our members will read and listen to some of these stories and be taken in by them. People who will be worried about a post-pandemic wave of austerity. Some of them will be susceptible to the Tories' divide and rule that we've seen before, where they will seek to turn people against each other based on whether they are British, whether they are an immigrant, whatever the colour of their skin, their sexuality, or ultimately whether they're public or private sector workers. Our answer must be unity. Our answer must be, we must fight against the austerity that's coming, but we must mobilise people now, and we have to win hearts and minds. And my final point is, therefore, it is incumbent on all of us to support all forms of protest, large or small, to be inspired by what happened in Glasgow, to be inspired by the other demonstrations that we have seen, but to not just think about the small local protests, but to think big. And I think we have to say to ourselves that we should be organising for a national day of action, supported by anti-racist organisations, trade unions, and anyone else, to ensure that we can get, now that we're going back to more normal times, tens, if not hundreds of thousands of people marching to say refugees are not just welcome here. We want them to be welcome here, to be part of our society, and we want to defeat the reactionary, dirty politics of this Tory government. And the way to do that is to mobilise in every way we can. Solidarity from PCS.
Great. Thank you very much for that, Mark. And now what I'd like to do, just before I introduce our next speaker, I'm just going to quickly read out a message. Beverly, who's quite rightly corrected me and says, mayors do not look after accommodation. They profit from providing abysmal accommodation to vulnerable people. So I just thought it was worth reading that out before I introduce our next speaker, who is Will Sullivan, another person I think who needs very little introduction, who's a friend of the anti-racist movement, an absolute key activist for Stand Up to Racism, as the TUC Race Equalities Officer. So Will, over to yourself.
Thank you, Nahida, and I just want to thank everybody for joining this call tonight. And I want to start off by saying, as many people have said, that you know, what the government are doing here is creating a solution to a problem that doesn't exist for the UK. And I say that because a problem does exist in terms of displaced people in this world. Last year, the United Nations published figures saying that displaced people across the world are at record levels. 80 million due to persecution, conflict and human rights violations. That number includes 30 million refugees, 4.2 million asylum seekers, as well as 45 million people that are internally displaced in their countries. That is a crisis, and increasingly what we see, because of the reactionary laws that are being passed around the world, increasing amounts of people being made stateless. The UN estimate that that's 4.2 million people. So when the British government says we have a problem in terms of refugees in the UK, it's an absolute lie. You know, when they try and claim that they're one of the best countries in the world for taking refugees through resettlement schemes, and in their introductory paper said, yes, we've taken 25,000. What they didn't say, that was 25,000 in total, right? This isn't about solving any kinds of problems. It's about the politics of nationalism, nativism, and racism. It is quite clear from what the government are doing that they are ripping up the 1951 UN Convention, which allows people to seek refuge in a country of their choice, not the government's choice, of their choice, and make their case for safety. And what this government is doing in relation to that is completely ripping up that convention, though trying to claim that they stay within the law, despite the fact that the UN have pointed this out. It's a bit like the politics of Trump, you know, that somebody says, this is a fact, and you say, well, no, that's fake news. So we're getting into the idea that actually what the UN says in terms of what is legal is now fake law. It's completely unacceptable. We wrote to the government back in May and said, actually, you're contravening in terms of your plans the UN Convention. Their response was not only to reject this, but to claim that that we have a generous asylum system that offers protection to the most vulnerable, defined and safe legal routes. Well, I'd like to challenge the government to say, what are the bloody legal routes to asylum in this country? Because after the bill is passed, there will be no legal routes to asylum in this country. And the idea that actually we can return people to countries just because they might have passed through them is ridiculous. And it's not workable, and they know it's not workable. But this isn't about workability. This is about pandering to racism, trying to get votes off the back of racism. Because they know this is what, when you start talking about swarms of people from the global south coming through as bogus asylum seekers trying to work in the UK, this is a strategy that they think will play well with the electorate. So I say we have to fight this bill. We have to fight this bill in all its aspects, but we also have to fight actually the way that they're making money out of this system. People have talked about, you know, the accommodation being outsourced to private companies who are making millions. The detention system. We have about 30,000 people locked up in immigration detention each year, often forced to work for £1 an hour. Right, was those companies like Serco and others who run those detention centres are raking in millions. So it's not just about abuse of human rights. It's about exploitation. The exploitation that we not only see out in our communities for those people that are vulnerable because of the immigration system, but within the heart of what government are running as well. Literal slavery, in my view, paying people £1 an hour to work in places that they are locked up in. How else can you describe that? So we have a challenge. We need to not only campaign against this bill, but we have to campaign against all the iniquities of the asylum and refugee system. We have to campaign against no recourse to public funds, about outsourcing and against outsourcing, about making it unlawful for asylum seekers to sustain themselves in this country, because you remove them the right to work, and in that sense remove their ability to sustain themselves. I'm going to finish by saying this. When I am at work, sit in an office outside a statue in the TUC done by a guy called Jacob Epstein. You know, it's a guy. It's a picture of somebody holding a dead child. Right? An extremely powerful statue commemorating the loss of lives of trade unionists in the 2 world wars. And those wars were about fighting nationalism, about fighting imperialism and fighting fascism. And the point I want to make about that is Jacob Epstein was a refugee. He was a refugee, and he was lucky as a refugee to be able to get here. Because ultimately, what the UN 1951 Convention is about is saying never again. Never again should we be allowing a state to commit genocide in the name of its people. And so I say, we cannot let the government do this in our name, not in our name. And that's why we have to fight this bill, and why we have to continue to fight for the rights and dignity of people, whether they're asylum seekers or whoever they are, and for justice and equality for everybody. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much for that, Wilf. Now, we do have a couple of more speakers. I think we've had a fantastic panel so far, and more than anything, I think that it demonstrates just the breadth of support we have from movement against racism, but in particular against this new immigration bill. So I'm going to introduce our next speaker. He's representing Amnesty International UK, and he's a Programme Director for Refugees and Immigration Rights. Steve, over to yourself.
Thank you very much. And it's a real pleasure to join everyone, and particularly obviously the speakers who've gone before me in addressing this really quite despicable piece of legislation that the government have presented and are debating as we speak. I do want, before moving on to just how atrocious this bill is, to acknowledge that its first 8 provisions actually will right, if implemented effectively, historical injustices in British nationality law that have affected many, many people for decades. The government has been forced to this by litigation on the whole, and it is extremely important that those first 8 clauses are properly scrutinised to be implemented effectively, because people's British nationality rights depend on them, and they've been deprived of them, as I said, for not just decades, but in some instances, generations. That said, everything with this bill goes downhill rapidly from clause 9, which starts with the repudiation not of the Refugee Convention, but with the Convention on the Reduction of Statelessness. This bill rips up in many ways the UK's international commitments to refugees, to stateless people, and indeed to children. And I want to emphasise that so we don't miss that the awfulness that is constituted by the great bulk of this bill in relation to asylum is not the full extent of the horrors that are contained in it. But we're largely focused here, for obvious reasons, on the refugee provisions. I want to make a few points that others have touched on, because I think they bear emphasising. Firstly, it has been rightly pointed out that we have been here before. For all that this is a horrific piece of legislation, at an extraordinary time, given how little responsibility at this moment in time the UK is either taking or even being asked to take for refugees in the world. But nonetheless, it is true that previous administrations of different political persuasions have introduced many of the measures that you find in this bill. It tells us that this fight is a long one, and we have to use this bill not only to galvanise ourselves for opposing it as it passes through Parliament, not only, as has been rightly emphasised, opposing it after it probably passes and opposing its implementation, but actually our fight has to last even longer than that. This country has been on an appalling trajectory of disrespect for the rights of refugees and migrants for, well, let's face it, decades. And unless and until there is much wider social and political will to change that, we will keep seeing ourselves back at times like this, faced with legislation like this. I also want to emphasize just what this bill is liable to do. Many people have emphasized the way in which it rips up our international obligations. It does that by this country seeking to essentially define for itself what are the international standards it agreed and negotiated with others 70 years ago. That is, apart from anything else, an open invitation to people, to countries across the world to renege on their own obligations too. This will do no good for anybody, because all it can do is provide the circumstances in which many more refugees find themselves without a place of safety wherever they are and needing to travel further in the hope of finding safety elsewhere. The second thing I want to emphasize is that all the focus from the government is and is going to be on the relatively small number of people whose personal crisis drives them to make dangerous journeys across the Channel, who are not in any way enlarging so far the asylum claims that this country receives. Very few claims by comparison to its nearest neighbours in Europe, and further afield, tiny by comparison. This country takes no share that is reasonable, equitable, let alone full, compared to either France, Italy, or Spain, let alone Lebanon, Uganda, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and so many other countries around the world. And that is a shocking disgrace, particularly to be pursuing these provisions at this particular time. And the final thing I want to emphasize is, despite all the rhetoric from ministers, the people who are going to benefit most from this bill and its measures are some of the people that ministers make the most noise about, that they are determined to tackle, to prevent, to prosecute, to strike down. That is criminal gangs who exploit and extort people. That is domestic slavers, domestic abusers, people who take advantage of those who are too afraid to enter our immigration or asylum system. And the response of this government is to make the deterrent of how fearful entering our asylum system or immigration system may be even more profound. This bill is not going to deter people who need to make journeys in the hope of finding safety here. It may well deter them from taking the journeys that they are on currently and persuade them that they must take even more dangerous journeys. Let's face it, people crossing the Channel from the nearest point in northern France to the nearest point on the southern coast of England are not doing anything particularly clandestine. It's an open secret. They are there to be seen. They want to be seen. And the Home Office knows full well they want to be seen. They want to be received. They want to enter the asylum system, not least because, as the Home Office also knows full well, the majority of them clearly not only have good reason to make their asylum claims, even when they are addressed, they will receive the asylum to which they are entitled. But if it's too frightening to enter our asylum system, people will make longer, more dangerous journeys to other parts of our coastline, or we will have more reversion to refrigerated lorries and trucks. And when they arrive here, hoping to avoid the authorities, living in terrible and dangerous circumstances, exploited by all sorts of more abusers, because they cannot provide for themselves and this country is reneging on its responsibilities to them. So any and every way by which you calculate what this bill sets out to do, it is a fundamental abomination, and we have lots of work to do together.
Steve, thank you so much for that. Gives us so much to think about. So I'm going to introduce our next speaker, who's an anti-racist immigration lawyer. It's Julian Bild. Julian, would you like to?
Thanks, Mahela. Sorry, thanks. Thanks for inviting me to speak today. I was just thinking of a couple of people. I think it was Kenan and Pinar talking about the appalling number of asylum seekers committing suicide in the UK, which is very, very sad. But it now looks like more, well, it's very hard to get hold of statistics. It's now looking like more young asylum seekers are killing themselves in the UK than are dying crossing the channel. And that's an appalling statistic. If, as the government says, it really was about the safety of asylum seekers and cutting down these dangerous smuggling rings, then you would think that they would be emphasising improving the care provided to young asylum seekers when they arrive. Now, I work as an immigration lawyer with a charity that represents victims of trafficking. Some of them will be asylum seekers, others not. But I just wanted to say a little bit about those measures in the bill addressed or targeting trafficking victims. And absolutely, they're targeting trafficking victims and clearly, as Steve said, not attacking the traffickers who can only gain from these measures by keeping people in exploitation who will be too scared to put their heads above the parapet and escape. So my clients will have been vulnerable probably all their lives, and it's that vulnerability, poverty largely, not having family support, perhaps mental illness, addictions that leads them to be trafficked in the first place. And of course, the trafficking events, which might involve being held for years in a rape house in the UK, being raped over and over again for months or sometimes years. And how does the government look at trafficking victims in the bill? Well, in the new plan for immigration, which was the presaged the bill and which has been turned into the bill, we have this sentence, our generous, and I have to put LOL in brackets there, our generous safeguards for victims are being rampantly abused by child rapists, people who pose a threat to national security, and failed asylum seekers with no right to be here. So in one sentence, we have victims of trafficking linked to child rapists, linked to terrorists, and linked to, oh my God, failed asylum seekers. Lowers and below, how low can you get as far as the government is concerned? So what's the factual basis for this statement? Well, there's none. So you'll have read in the Observer over the weekend, a very well-respected anti-trafficking organisation made a freedom of information request to the Home Office for statistics on the numbers of child rapists, terrorists, and failed asylum seekers in the trafficking system. And the response was from the Home Office, we just don't know, we would have to trawl every file and it will be too expensive to do so. So right at the heart of the new plan is this huge lie associating victims of trafficking with child rapists, lumping terrorists together with failed asylum seekers. Okay, poisonous stuff. This is really out of a Nazi propaganda playbook. And I really wonder whether they're paying royalties to Katie Hopkins for this stuff. And it's not surprising in that context that the Home Office completely ignored what was really a fake consultation exercise before the bill was drafted. So the new plan for immigration, consultation exercise where organisations like my own were told we could respond to the new plan, and then the government completely ignores the consultation by simply putting the new plan straight into the bill without any changes at all. Okay, so again, as Steve indicated, the overwhelming majority of asylum seekers and victims of trafficking are found to be telling the truth. Sadly, when it comes to those who are victims of trafficking, only about 10% are actually granted permission to stay in the UK. And one of the measures in the bill is to reduce that number further. So effectively, when a trafficking victim is found and accepted by the Home Office to be a victim, the Home Office thinks that's the time to be sending them home. 90% will be refused discretionary leave as victims of trafficking. And of course, very often that will be sent back right into the arms of the traffickers. Okay, but the bill makes it clear that it's going to be even harder to be accepted as a victim of trafficking. The presumption, and again, there's no data on this, that many migrants will be entering the trafficking system with fake stories, and the idea of this bill is to increase the standard of proof, so to make it even more difficult for trafficking victims to prove or get the Home Office to accept what's happened to them. So instead of having to show that they may have been exploited, they're having to show they will or were exploited, so significantly changing the basis upon which their stories will be assessed. And of course, how do we prove what's happened to us in the past? You know, lots of things have happened to me in the past. I couldn't prove them, certainly not to a cynical decision maker. The other measures that the government have introduced, of course, to massively cut access to legal aid makes it even more difficult for these people to prove what has happened to them, a lack of medical reports, a lack of statements, etc. So currently we have victims languishing in the trafficking system for 2 or 3 years. You know, if it really was about saving money, you know, one of the biggest calls for in the trafficking sector is for victims of trafficking to be allowed to work while they're in the system, to be able to support themselves. And of course, that would massively save the government money.
Julian, I'm going to
says no, people will come here to work and we're not going to let them do that. So in fact, a big lie right at the centre of this bill, one which is really designed to make it more difficult for victims to escape from their traffickers, and one which will undoubtedly ensure that many victims do not escape or will be sent back to trafficking situations.
Great. Thank you very much for that, Julian. And apologies for cutting in there, but thanks so much. So I'm now going to introduce our final speaker, who is Wayman Bennett. He's a co-convener of Stand Up to Racism. Wayman.
I'd like to start off by thanking all the speakers because they've spoken so eloquently and so clearly about why we've got to resist this bill. And I think that we're under special attack. I think we're under special attack because I think there are 3 bills going through Parliament. One of the bills is the Asylum Bill, but you cannot ignore the fact there's another bill going through, which is about the right to protest and oppose these attacks. It's a combined effort to divide and rule. Why do I raise that? I raise that because one of the things that Priti Patel did was target the very people who are trying to defend refugees and asylum seekers. And this is what's different about what's taking place now. There's a combined effort to stifle the very organisations that have made a decisive difference. The Amnesty Internationals, the Joint Council for Welfare of Immigration, the Safe Passages. There's an attempt to silence them. And I think that one of the things that we want to do with Stand Up to Racism is, as well as their grassroots activity and the careful work they have done in terms of explaining to people why refugees are should be supported, is we have to defend these organisations. And I say why I think this is important is because I think without the mass, what the government is trying to do, they're afraid that there is mass support for refugees and asylum seekers. And I think that one of the things that Pollokshields shows us is we have to do 2 things. Defend the institutions when they're trying to attack the legal right for asylum, and at the same time defend our neighbours and our communities when they attempt to deport them, lock them up. The government, by its own admission, has said just the extra cost that they're adding is £468 million extra on top of what they're already spending. A complete waste of money that should go into the pockets of those people who are looking after refugees. And we say very clearly that refugees are welcome here. And I completely agree with what people have said. It is a policy of divide and rule, of racism and of nationalism. They're seeking not just to influence people here, they're trying to join with the Danish government to influence policy across the world for placing people across into other places. And that's why the false aspiration that Britain is a safe haven, and that they are arguing internationally for the removal of the 1951 right and what's taken place in Article 16. This is not a small attack, this is a big attack. And I think I want to second what people like Mark Serwotka said about why we have to take days of action joined together. I think by only unifying ourselves together that we can show that how we can push this back. And that's the reason why I support the call for the day of action. And I'm really happy to work with others to make sure that happens. I actually think there's a risk to life. If you let people drown across the channel, it's a risk to life. No, and what's ever done to one group of people will be done to everybody else. Every asylum and immigration act passed in this country has then used to be informed for welfare, for anything else. As soon as they've attacked the weakest group, that is added to other people. And I share no apologies by saying our group was founded by Holocaust survivors. And I remember Lord Dubs speaking when we formed the group, and he said when he was 14, he had to leave his brothers and his sisters at the station as he made his way here. And we were told that was never going to happen again. Or Leon Greenman, a survivor from Auschwitz, who told us exactly the same thing, or being denied access from Dutch, he was Dutch, from being denied access. And we were told that the whole provision was that it wasn't going to happen again, and we're seeing that ripped up. But I'm not pessimistic about what we can do, because I do believe that the majority of people are not like our government. You know, that's the reason why Boris Johnson doesn't understand booing people taking an anti-racist activity is a problem, and the majority of people support that. That's the reason why he thinks there's one law for him, a law and for the government that doesn't apply to everybody else. And we have to defeat them. And we have to defeat them because what we're doing is right. And we have to have the confidence that the people on our side can see through that, providing we're organized. I repeat, providing we're organized. There are 6 million organised trade unions in this country. There are hundreds of thousands of NGOs. And I think the government's attempt to divide and rule us from asylum seekers and refugees is the same way they're trying to divide organisations and play them against themselves. I remember going with Clare for Calais when we went to, for calling the demonstration over Aaron Kurdi and going to Calais and literally saving people's lives, And I think that the question that a human being can be made illegal, human beings are not illegal. And I'll end up with this. Britain takes a paltry 35,000 people to this country. And so Stop to Racism has said they're welcome here. But I absolutely commit our organisation to working with any organisation that wants to resist this bill, not just now, but afterwards, because as people have already said, not in our name. And do you mean, I think we have to understand that what's being pushed culturally now is something that's going to take us back 70 years, take us back to the dark days where people simply lost their lives because people could make political capital by demonizing them, by scapegoating them. So I support what Diane Abbott has said and what Bell Ribeiro has said, is that we have to fight in Parliament, we have to support the organisations in the law courts, but we also have to take to the streets, and we have to show that our size in numbers is the most important thing, that we have both voice of energy and resistance. If we do that, we can overcome this bill. We have to be confident, and we have to give voice to the voiceless. I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you very much for that, Wayman. And thank you, everyone, all of our speakers tonight. It's been absolutely fantastic. Thank you to everyone that's been watching at home and sharing the comments and making comments and sharing the event. It has been streamed on Facebook and on YouTube, so people will be able to go and share it amongst people that haven't been able to watch it today. So that's great news, and we do want people to do that. It's very important that the message from all of our speakers tonight gets out there to as broad an audience as possible. The only thing left to say is a couple of things coming up from Stand Up to Racism. A key event that we want people to sign up for is the International Conference on the 16th of October. It will be an online event. If you're on Facebook, we are sharing the link to that in the chat. So please do go into that the chat, do select the link, do register with the event. It's an opportunity to carry on some of the discussions we've had today, but also bring together other streams of work that Stand Up to Racism and local groups are involved in, to share our experiences, to learn from each other and help build a mass movement. The only other thing for me to say is, if you're not already a member of Stand Up to Racism, please do join us. We want people to be part of an organisation that can really be ready for the battle ahead. And the attacks on refugees is just, although shocking and horrific, is just a small part of the work that we do. And we want people to be involved in that and help build to really stop the racism coming from this government. So yes, please do join Stand Up to Racism. Follow us on social media. We're on Facebook, we're on Twitter, Instagram, and no doubt other places, YouTube as well. So help us get the word out there. And the only thing left to say is thank you very much for watching and joining us for tonight's meeting. Stay safe and enjoy the rest of the evening. Solidarity.